organisms don't actually exist, right? Organisms are a way to think of large groups of cells that act as part of a greater whole. They act.
Sorry, when you say organisms don't exist, you mean to say that they're just a collection of molecules that move in a particular way and we model them as organisms?
An organism is a function that describes the interaction between a group of cells. And it's a function that is different from a bunch of cells because it says that some of the cells are not helpful to the organism, right? It's a function that describes a control structure. There are cells which don't belong to the organism even though they are in the same region. And some of these cells even share the same genome, but there might be tumors, for instance, and the organism tries to get rid of them. And so the organism is, in some sense, a function that describes an order. And the same way, a society or a civilization is a function that describes this order. And the organism, if you look closely, only exists approximately, right? Because you cannot describe everything that happens there using that thing. If you look at reality, you only can do this in a hypothetical space where you reason about what lots of cells are doing. And the same thing is true for a society or for cells. And this notion of the emergence of a society that is entirely coherent, where the behavior of all the individuals has sense with respect to the greater whole, this coincides with the invention of the concept of gods. And I think they are basically the same concept. It's the idea that individuals can interact in such a way that they form an agent on the next level of description. And this agent is sentient, it has a relationship to the world around it, has goals, and a relationship to its constituents, to the parts. And you can see in the history of the religions that this relationship to the constituent parts changes, right? The old Abrahamic God is really a mean fucker. He doesn't care about the individuals. What he does to Job, just to prove a point to the devil, is horrible, right? From the perspective of an individual. But from the perspective of an organism doing something to its cells, it doesn't matter at all. Right? Of course, the organism is able to do things to its cells, and the cells are not supposed to care about this because they belong to the organism. They are owned by the organism. They only exist by the grace of the organism and for the good of the organism.
It reminds me of what you describe fascism as like.
Yes, exactly. And the idea of, for instance, the introduction of Jesus Christ and Catholicism was necessary to deal with a religion that was compatible with the Roman Empire. So you want to have a society where you already have Pax Romana and every individual has something like its own dignity and its own role, regardless of the society. And you need to make a good offer to these individuals, and you need to structure the relationship between the individuals and allow them to grow into the part of the organism. So you introduce humanism. And the entire idea of Jesus Christ, I think, is the introduction of humanism into this Hebrew religion. And of course, the Hebrew religion has changed later on and became more humanist in other ways. But I think that originally the invention or the introduction of the concept of Jesus was exactly this humanization of this resulting hyperorganism. And we have been selected to be part of an hyperorganism. People that didn't play their role in the hyperorganism and were unwilling to subscribe to it, they were often killed, right? They didn't have a lot of offspring. And we did this for a period of many, many generations, literally over more than 1,000 years. And so most of the people that live today on this planet are the result of having grown up in such systems of organization. And so they are selected for these systems of organizations. We are all selected for feeling part of something that is much larger than a tribe or a family. We are part of a transcendental greater whole of some civilization. And the old word before Enlightenment for this civilization was God. We are reluctant to use this word because it's so tainted by the mythology of the cults that we invented or that were invented to stabilize the civilizations. Right? The religions invented mythologies that are not possibly true, that don't have evidence going for them and cannot have possible evidence, like creator gods cannot have evidence for them. You cannot observe as an inhabitant of the universe an act that relates to its creation, and any statement thereof will only be a mental state that the individual has, not something that is a valid experiment that tells you something about reality. So gods are mental constructs. They are about as real as selves, which are also mental constructs. A god is a self.
So gods are as real as you, in the sense that you are a mental construct?
Yes. Gods are basically selves that span multiple minds. And the Greek gods are good examples for that. So the Greek gods are stable because they are all archetypes. They're all certain extremes of psychology or connections of extremes of psychology that give rise to some kind of a human archetype. And this makes them immortal. You can refer to them across human beings, and you can treat them as if they would exist. And then there are the demigods, like Hercules, who exists because he has stories that make him immortal. But this thing that you can live in the mind of another person or of an organism and move from one mind to another one, this is what makes you a god in this conception of the Greeks. It's not the normative force that our religions had. And in our religions, the identification of a god is not just it's an immortal superhero comic character, but it's some kind of archetype. Instead, it's a singular thing. It's monotheist god, or it's a subset of it that is like a limb of that god that is describing what our civilization ought to be seen as. And the relationship that we have to that god is established, for instance, in prayer. Prayer is an activity in which we meditate about the properties of God and the relationships that we have to God, and thereby establish God. And in the process of prayers, gods can even become conscious if that's part of their specification, even though they use the hardware of the human brain, of the individual human brain.
So in some sense, prayer works, even though the god doesn't exist in the physicalist sense. It exists in some abstract sense.
Yes, of course. The prayer changes the relationships that people have to each other and the identifications that people have. They change what people think is right and normal and good and what they want to do. And they change the way they interact, how they share resources.
Do you
Of
pray?
course, no.
Do you meditate?
Yes. And I could say that there is, maybe everybody prays in a certain way, in the sense that we try to spend time in establishing our relationship to the greater whole and reflect on that. So I would say that in a very secular way I'm praying. But I grew up in a world where the religious cults were seen as repulsive because they are antagonistic to rationality. And I take issue with the anti-rationalism of the way the mythology of religions is enforced. So somebody who forces me to believe things that are manifestly untrue just to have a checksum on my mind that distinguishes me from non-believers is violating me. That's why I cannot be part of such a cult. At least not in my present state. I can only be part of something that is compatible with being rational. And this means retaining autonomy over my identity and over my thoughts and over my morality and over my beliefs. Without that identity, I cannot be part of something. And there are groups that act like this. And you could say that they are spiritual, but they're probably not religious, at least not in the traditional sense, because they don't have organized religion for the most part.